Well, Sean Winter, welcome to Love Rinse Repeat's 50th episode special, The 7 Last Words from the Cross.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Liam.
No, it's wonderful to be chatting with you. So here we go. I'll read our words out for us and for everyone listening at home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. So, Sean, what do you hear in these words?
Well, it's only one word in the Greek, actually. It's interesting. It's just a single verb, and is one of those kind of economical phrases in the Gospel of John that once you scratch it, kind of evokes a whole set of questions. But look at the basic level of a human story and a plausible scene of a crucifixion scene in first century Judea. It's a cry of deep human suffering and deep human need at a point of intense personal trauma and crisis. It's very difficult for us to know, I think, whether someone later on remembered that Jesus had expressed thirst at the cross, or whether, what was the process by which the words from the cross were conveyed into the early Christian tradition. It's almost impossible to know how that happened, but it's deeply plausible, right? That someone being crucified, struggling for breath, might use what energy they have left to express thirst and the need for some small degree of human comfort at a time of enormous suffering and proximity to death. So I think at one level, that's really the basis of what this story is doing, and it has lots of other associations, but it's a bit like the cry of dereliction. One of the other sayings, of course, my God, why have you forsaken me? For someone in a situation of deep human suffering and deep human need, under this extreme violence being perpetrated against you, it's a cry for help. It's a cry for some small form of relief in the context of the crucifixion scene.
Thank you for that. And I think that's right. I think that I really like that way of going. I wonder if there's a bit of a tension even in the text where there's a bit of an interpretation going on that, okay, he's saying he's thirsty, which, yes, you might think at first means because he's, a human being struggling with great torment, but it's actually to fulfill the scriptures.
Yeah.
Now, exactly what, there's no particular, the text itself is just assuming which one that is, I guess. But do you think that's almost like some tension developing there in the way it's been passed from, through communities of, yes, he did say that, but just remember, he was very much in control, which seems a very Johannine thing. He's very much in control of what's happening here. This is the glorification.
Yeah, look, so, we cover that several ways. First of all, this thing about Jesus expressing thirst at the crucifixion scene is it's a gospel tradition across the 4 canonical gospels. So John is the only one who captures it into a saying from the cross. Yeah. But in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, I think Jesus is offered a drink twice. And the first one he denies, the second one, we assume he kind of receives it. In the Gospel of Luke, I think it's part particularly of the kind of taunting of Jesus. Will he take a drink? So we've got an example of what the Gospel of John does with almost every tradition that John receives into his account of the life of Jesus, which is that it is embedded in layers of additional interpretation. And one of the layers of interpretation that the Gospel of John works with, similarly to other Gospels, is this notion of Scripture's fulfillment. So the language and the imagery of thirst and the alleviation of thirst is already a metaphor and an image, a symbol that's been worked out at several points earlier in the Gospel of John. We can talk about those texts in a bit if you want. So when a reader gets to this point, the language of thirst, the reference to wine, the fulfillment of Scripture, these are all Johannine symbolic themes. So that's absolutely true, I think. And then the other interesting thing to observe, this notion of fulfillment of Scripture, so that the verb that John uses here is not the same verb as he uses elsewhere. So he uses the Greek verb teleoo, which means to complete, and it actually appears twice in the verse. So Jesus knew that all was now finished. We get one version of that verb. And then in order to fulfill the Scripture, it's the same verb that's used. So the fulfillment of Scripture here means Scripture is being fulfilled in the fulfillment of the work, the mission, the vocation of Jesus at his crucifixion.
Yeah.
And of course, that culminates in the cry in verse 30, where the same verb is used again. It is finished, or it is completed, or it is accomplished. So it's exactly the same verb that's being used. So you're absolutely right. This expression of human need in a context of suffering relates actually to a Johannine theme that says, don't worry, Jesus is in control of all of this. This is the plan working itself out. Of course, we know that John's account of the passion of Jesus is shot through with very strong indications that this is not the journey of a passive, weak victim. It is the journey of a victorious king in some way or another. And part of that narrative, part of that account, is that John does tend to remove references to human suffering or to passive acceptance. Jesus is very much, in as Kaiserman's words, kind of God striding across the earth at this point in the story. But in John, that is always a tension. That never obliterates the fundamentally human, plausible historical narrative. I'm not saying it's historical in its detail, but it's plausible that this is an account of genuine human suffering and a real Roman crucifixion and absolutely a concrete and real death. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's helpful holding that together. I'm wondering, you're starting to kind of touch on them again. We get a bit of a string of the last words really packed together here in John. So we've just had, behold thy son, behold thy mother. So, the beloved disciple and Jesus' mum being brought in to become a new family. And we're just about to get to, it is finished. And this is kind of wedged in. I'm wondering if there's some sort of progression here in the sense of, okay, Jesus kind of ties up affairs, or at least has some sort of statement about a community he is forming, about other people. And then he's going to have this kind of cosmic, grand scale thing of it is accomplished. And then here is this one wedged in, which is more for him, like more about him and his moment there. I wonder if that's something, or if I'm just, inventing theories in this moment.
Oh, look, I think there might be something in that. And of course, if in verse 30, I know you'll get to it, but if in verse 30, you read the language of Jesus giving up his spirit, if you read that as Jesus giving up the spirit, which is perfectly plausible, you get this rich symbolic interaction between the new community that's been formed, the death of Jesus, which in the Gospel of John, of course, is constructed as a departure. It's a glorification, an exaltation to God, and then the gift and bequeathing of the Spirit to this new community. So I think that you're probably right that I'm fulfilling Scripture in this moment of need, in this articulation of thirst, probably focuses on this is the point at which there is this transition between the work of Jesus, which fulfills the scriptural prophecies, in this case Psalm 69 probably, that actually generates a transition into a new dispensation or a new age, which is marked by Jesus' absence, but the Spirit's presence. And of course, in John's Gospel, the previous, chapters 15 to 17, the farewell discourses, have basically been an extended meditation on exactly that theme. We're about to get to a point in the story where I'm not going to be with you, but I'm sending another paraclete who will be with you to encourage you and to strengthen you. So I think it is a personal saying. I thirst, it's in the first person singular, but that's the completion of that personal mission launches this new dispensation which is community focused. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you flagged this a bit earlier that obviously thirst is something that's been brought up a lot already in the gospel.
Yeah.
And Jesus has promised indeed that those who drink from the living waters will never be thirsty again. Yet he is thirsty in this moment. Do you want to talk a little about how we, see this as kind of, this is obviously a very written gospel. Like, the words and phrases have been chosen very deliberately and built to a moment where this is that, like, wow, I see something.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little about that, where thirst is running through here.
Well, I think as all good symbolism, it's open to any number of different possible kind of lines of interpretation through it. I remember many years ago reading a book purportedly on another subject. So there's a great little book by Stephen Moore called Post-Structuralism in the New Testament, Derrida and Foucault at the Foot of the Cross. And in that book, he has an exposition of the Samaritan woman story. So the point is that the I thirst, this is not the first time Jesus is thirsty in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, right. Yep.
At the beginning of the Samaritan woman story, he arrives saying, "Give me a drink." And Stephen Moore has this fantastic deconstructive essay on the way in which the relationship with the Samaritan woman. So who is genuinely thirsty in this gospel is the question. And on the one hand, it initially is Jesus, but then that flips over to the Samaritan woman who says back to Jesus, "Give me this drink always, and I will never be thirsty." You then get the material in chapter 7 about Jesus offering a drink so that none will thirst. And you think that that's all sorted. Jesus isn't the thirsty one, the woman is.
Yeah.
But then you come to this story, and Jesus articulates thirst again. And Moore has this very clever then thing about the relationship between wine and water, and how that then, how water changes into wine. So the water of the Samaritan story becomes wine in this story. Someone else provides the wine for Jesus to sate his thirst, and water and blood come out of his side as a bequeathal of the Spirit. Out of his belly shall come streams of living water, from chapter 7. So I'm not sure that's clear in terms of what it means, but the richness of the symbolism is absolutely evident to me. And what comes out of that for me above all is this notion that the thirst of Jesus is articulated in such a way that it is not an exclusively Christological symbol. It's a symbol that actually evokes something of the human quest for, well, whatever the human characters of the Gospel of John are questing for. For truth in the case of the Samaritan woman, for the truth about her own circumstances and situation, for justice, for knowledge and understanding, all sorts of things along the way, for forgiveness. Jesus is constructed in this gospel not simply as the one who comes along and delivers the answers, but who shares the condition of asking those questions or articulating those needs. And that happens even in this scene of great human vulnerability and suffering.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. One place that my mind started to go as I was thinking about this word, particularly in the current context of the church dispersed, distance, isolated, is one of the main conversations we see that the church has rushed to is the conversation about communion. Yep. And how should this be done? Can it be done online? And obviously it's going to vary widely based on the ecclesial tradition and sacramental theology and all this kind of thing. But I was wondering if there's anything in this word for this discussion, not necessarily be the defining, here's the answer word, but given what you're saying about Jesus, who shares in the human, the quest for what it is that Jesus is bringing, Jesus who himself thirsts, Jesus, and what you were saying earlier about the interesting shift that's about to happen in presence and absence, and the Spirit coming in a non-localized body. That there is something here, I think, to speak into this situation where many of us are thirsting for this ritual, this sacrament, but perhaps there is something in leaning into these words, in living in these words of Jesus, in living in the thirst by waiting that might be evoked through this.
Yeah, good. I mean, I don't know who will watch this, but for many people within mainstream Christian traditions, my position on this in relation particularly to the Gospel of John is pretty heretical. I'm actually with Bultmann. I think the theological vision at the heart of this gospel is pretty anti-sacramental in the direct sense, which is why we don't get Jesus baptized. We don't get an account of the Last Supper. And what functionally operates in the gospel in a way that leaves little or no room for concern about sacraments as we would understand them, is the agency and the activity and presence of the Spirit. So the presence of the Spirit means that access to these things that we are looking for is unmediated. Sacraments don't deliver them to us, and we don't need them in that way. That involves you with a whole load of exegesis about born of water of Spirit in chapter 3 and also John 6 and all the rest of it. But I think the point very clearly is, and you put your finger on it in the way that you've articulated the question, is that we constantly have a journey to and fro from the question of physical presence of some sort and an absence that nonetheless conveys presence, spiritual presence, if you like. So, you know, the flesh and blood Jesus of this story disappears from the story at this point in one way, is exalted to God, but the Spirit is given. I don't think that resolves the question about, you know, in what cases do you not stop worrying about physical presence being in the same room as each other, whether it's real bread or real wine or whether, you know, whatever else that might be. It doesn't answer those questions, but it does tell us that very early on in the Christian tradition, there was an understanding of the implications of Christological claims in particular, the claims about Jesus, that meant that people were saying, none of this is guaranteed.
Yeah.
There isn't anything physical that's going to give you what you need. But neither is it completely spiritual, because the spiritual actually relates you back to particularly the life of Jesus of Nazareth, which is flesh. You know, Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I mean, the interpretation of John's Gospel in the history of the church is bound up with the exploration of all of those questions. You know, the battle between, you know, Gnostic interpretations in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and more mainstream Orthodox interpretations. But John is useful for reminding us that right at the early period, there were people who struggled with those questions. And on that basis, I think it gives a degree of permission for us to continue to explore them. What constitutes presence? What constitutes, does physical absence mean that presence is not existing in some other form or another? What does, how does the articulate, where do we find the appropriate response to our articulation of human need or the human quest? Stephen Moore's point about the Samaritan woman and this story is, in both cases, Jesus' articulation of our quest for or need for what Jesus provides is not met by him, it's met by someone else in the story. And therefore the question of where we look to find presence or the reality of the Spirit's presence, I think then is opened up for possibility. And, you know, my own view is, isn't it really interesting to think about how that might be? Well, we find that through pixels on a screen in a digital reality rather than a physical face-to-face reality. Those are really interesting theological questions, it seems to me.
Thank you for that, Sean. I think that's a great place to land this plane, and particularly with the encouragement that if people want to ask theological questions and want to do so online, they should check out Pilgrim Theological College.
They should indeed. If this runs on for 6 months, and if people feel that they need some good structured study opportunities. We'll be moving all our semester 1 units are online, and if necessary, all our semester 2 units will go there as well. Please come and get in touch with us. Go to the website pilgrim.edu.au.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the plug. Thank you.
That's all right. And I can say that, you don't even need a pandemic to study at Pilgrim online, because I did it for many years. So
absolutely. We've got great graduates.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, Sean.
You're welcome. Thanks.